It's The World This Week, 7 days, 4 Paris-based correspondents, 1 hour. The World This Week in partnership with the Daily Beast. Daily Beast foreign editor Christopher Dickey joins us, well, from the mothership in New York. How are you, sir?
I'm fine. Fine, Francois. Very good to see you.
Good to see you as well. Also joining us, Claire Byrne, France editor at the French news agency AFP. How are you?
Good fun, thank you.
All right. Sylvie Kaufmann, editorial director at French broadsheet of record Le Monde. Nice to see you.
Good evening.
Also with us, commentator and political consultant Philippe Moreau-Chevrolet.
Hello, Francois.
You look tanned and relaxed.
I am tanned and relaxed, actually.
Okay, it's only April. The World This Week on Facebook and on Twitter, the hashtag World This Week. First, it was the horrific images out of the besieged Syrian rebel enclave of eastern Ghouta, then claims of at least 40 dead in a chemical attack. Then came the tweet. Donald Trump saying that Russia vows to shoot down any and all missiles fired at Syria. Get ready, Russia, because they will be coming nice and new and smart. You shouldn't be partners with a gas-killing animal, capital letters, who kills his people and enjoys it. That was Donald Trump on Wednesday, but by Friday, there was wavering. International chemical weapons inspectors arriving in Damascus, and Trump's self-imposed deadline for action had come and gone, putting his subordinates, well, in spin mode.
I am unbelievably proud of how President Trump has looked at the information, analyzed, not let anyone rush him into this, because he has said from the beginning, we have to know what we're right, we have to know all the information, we have to know that there's proof, and we have to know that we're taking every precaution necessary should we take action.
Christopher Dickey, what's going on?
Well, a lot of people are wondering that. Essentially, Trump got ahead of his skis. He wants to make a point about these chemical weapons. He wants to look like the tough guy standing up to Assad. He seems to have discovered suddenly that Assad has been using chlorine against his enemies, although he's been doing that now for quite a while, long since the April 17th attack last year, and that was supposed to stop him from using chemical weapons. And I think that he had also created a huge problem for himself a couple of weeks ago when he said he wanted to take everybody, all the Americans, 2,000-some troops out of Syria, which led to a lot of pushback from the Pentagon and from conservatives and lots of people in the United States who said that would be a very stupid idea. So when he saw those pictures of the children suffering from the chlorine attack, he reacted. And he reacted with his first tweets. And then when a Russian diplomat in Lebanon said, well, we'll attack the bases that fire the missiles and we'll shoot all the missiles down, then he reacted to that. He was in reaction mode all along. Now he's actually been sort of brought up short a little bit. And people are saying to him, both internationally and in his own councils, let's think carefully about what we do and how we do it if we're going to take action against Syria.
Right. Short of being incredibly proud, are you reassured by Donald Trump's decision to pause?
I can't think of any decision from Donald Trump who's reassured me since he's been in office. So, fortunately, he's not alone on this. I mean, there are other governments looking very carefully at this. The French government, the British government, and presumably some other allied governments. I think what they are doing is they are trying not to rush into any decision. Last year there was already, the United States did strike Syria last year after a chemical attack. Actually, I think it was exactly a year ago.
Yeah, it was exactly a year ago.
And with some, I think about 50 cruise missiles which hit an airbase, a Syrian airbase. And that, I must say, for a while, for a few months, there were no chemical attacks. So, but you want to, I think now they are looking beyond this. They want to be more efficient. They don't want to be just symbolic. On the other hand, they have the Russians, as you pointed out, threatening to retaliate. And nobody not even the Russians, want an escalation here. So I think the problem is they don't want to rush, and they are right. On the other hand, the longer they wait, and the longer the Syrians, the Russians, the Iranians can, do whatever they want to get ready.
Even if they strike now, has Assad already achieved his aims, which was to win that last big rebel enclave near the capital?
Yes, the Ghouta has fallen, so that's one objective, but there are still a few rebel strongholds in the north. There's Idlib, which should be the next target, and that's also why France, the US and UK and others have to be very, very careful, because we have to prevent Assad from using those chemical weapons again.
Philippe Moreau-Chevrolet?
I think there are two things. The first thing is that we have been surprised maybe in France to see that the French president would go live on TV, supporting Trump's position by saying that we had proofs. We would have proofs one day of the use of chemical weapons.
Yeah, because Emmanuel Macron made that statement on Thursday, that there is definitive proof and that it is Assad's...
He didn't say definitive, but he said that
he said there was definitive proof and that it was Assad's fault and that it was Assad who was to blame. Mm-hmm. And yet we're hearing this Friday the U.S.'s ambassador to the UN saying we're still going over the evidence.
Yeah, there are two things. I think there's a coalition, kind of a coalition against Russia in a way, a diplomatic action against Russia that is behind the scenes and that may explain this whole movement around Syria. It's maybe not about Syria altogether. Maybe it's partly about the relationships with Russia. And the other thing is that we got used now to this kind of talk from a U.S. president, and he's using Twitter as a strategic communication tool, which is unnerving because it's really quick and it can change everything. But he's in control of the debate in a way around Syria, doing that. So
he's setting the tempo.
Trump is not always a loser in that game.
Not always a loser in that game.
I try to be diplomatic, contrary to Trump.
Because there was this tweet from him saying that relations are at their worst, even during the Cold War, Claire Byrne.
Yes, he did say that, and it certainly around Wednesday it started to look that way. When, as you say, Russia said, well, if you strike us, we'll take you down and your launch bases, so presumably whatever ships or aircraft or that you fire these missiles from, which would be war. And
see, here's the thing. Philippe there, he's looking at it from the communication standpoint. Oh, yeah, Trump is owning the news cycle. He's dictating the conversation. In our newsroom, I don't know what it was like at AFP. People were alarmed when they saw those tweets on Wednesday.
That's right. That's why I think we're seeing all these headlines on Wednesday. Along the lines of, are we headed towards World War III here? How can we dial this thing back? Then, of course, Donald Trump, and he has form in this, as we've seen with Kim, with North Korea, Rocket Man, and threatening to pour, fire on North Korea, and then kind of rowing back from that. He does have form on this, on over-egging the pudding and then pulling it back. However, it does feel like both he and Emmanuel Macron have pushed the boat out to a point where they actually have to follow through on this. And Emmanuel Macron is coming up on his first year in office, and he has made he has staked his whole first year on this idea that he does what he said he was going to do. And he said he set a red line of the use of chemical weapons. He said it when Vladimir Putin came to Versailles in July. And he's got to follow through on that. And even today, just today, the French Foreign Ministry put out this sort of video, sort of galvanizing public reaction for strikes, saying we assume our responsibilities. At the same time, the Elysée put out a statement saying, well, we're talking to Russia about trying to intensify dialogue on a lasting peace and talking about trying to negotiate ceasefires, more humanitarian assistance, and the mention of Idlib yesterday from Macron, so possibly about pressuring Russia to lean on Assad not to use chemical weapons in Idlib, or maybe even to kind of hold back in Idlib.
But Claire, how do you read Emmanuel Macron? Back in 2013, we remember that when the red line, when there was that chemical attack, France's president at the time, François Hollande, was ready to go. How do you sense, is Macron the same as Hollande or different?
I must say, today it has felt a bit like France is a little bit more gung-ho than America. However, I think that they will very much... they do seem to be kind of more in sync this time than Hollande was with Obama. And possibly there's a better relationship there between Macron and Trump. Macron does seem to have traction with Trump. François Hollande was, and he was promoting his book this year, looking back on his presidency, and he really did feel he was hung out to dry by Barack Obama when he said, he pulled up short and said, I have to consult Congress, and then they came up then with this deal to destroy Syria's chemical weapons stockpiles.
Which was
Syria said it would.
Which was offered by Putin at the time,
exactly,
yeah.
And not enforced.
And not enforced, yeah. Exactly.
Christopher Dickey, do you agree there with Claire that perhaps Macron is more in sync with Trump than Hollande was with Obama?
Well, not necessarily. I think you have to listen very carefully to what Macron was saying. And the key phrase in his remarks was that they were not going to attack the allies of Assad. It doesn't only mean they're not going to attack the Russians. We take it as a given they don't want to attack the Russians. It more pointedly means Macron does not want to attack the Iranians. Now, that's a huge issue because remember that we now have as the National Security Advisor a real Iran hawk, John Bolton, who very probably is pushing to go after the Iranians. Certainly, the Israelis want the Americans to go after the Iranians. That's exactly what the Israelis did last week when they hit the T4 air base. They were targeting the Iranians. The big question is, who is the U.S. going to attack, if it attacks, and presumably it will, and what does it expect to achieve? You know, the whole history of pinpoint attacks, tailored attacks, limited strikes by the United States is a truly miserable one. I spent much of my career in the 80s and 90s going to places we were about to bomb, watching the bombing take place, and watching the results be almost exactly the opposite of what Washington expected or claimed that it expected from those attacks. Whether we're talking about punishment attacks like Libya in 1986, or taking out the Libyan leadership in 2000, whenever it was, 2012, or 2011, 2012. So across the board, whether we're talking about Libya, Lebanon, Iraq, you have very limited options, and they're none of them good when you start making vows that you're going to change the behavior of a country. You can either go for a diplomatic solution, which is what Obama wound up doing in 2013. You can have pinpoint strikes, which have no effect. What doesn't kill a dictator makes him stronger. You can try and take out the dictator, which is what happened with Gaddafi. That didn't work out very well. Or you can occupy the country, which is what happened in Iraq. That didn't work out very well either. So what is it that you want to achieve? I think, frankly, Trump doesn't know. He wants a show of force because it reflects on him. Because a year ago, his attack got him good reviews, good ratings. But I don't think he knows what he wants to accomplish with this. That's why he says 1 week we're going to get out of Iraq, get out of Syria, and the next week he says we're going to punish Assad, and Assad is an animal. Are we going to leave the animal in power? Well, probably we will.
And that brings us back to the point you made at the outset. I'm going to put it to Sylvie Kaufmann. Before the U.S. Senate, this Thursday and Friday, you've got CIA Director Mike Pompeo promising to toe a tough line if he's confirmed as Secretary of State when it comes to Russia. This at the tail end of a week that began, as you say, with the super hawkish Bush-era UN ambassador, John Bolton, starting his new job as National Security Advisor. So, Sylvie Kaufmann, it's kind of a question of who's whispering in Trump's ear.
Yeah, well, Chris was asking the right question. what do they want to achieve? And he rightly reminded us of what happened in Iraq and in Libya. I think this is not about regime change, and this is a very important point. I think, at least in the eyes of, or in the opinion of the French government, it is not about regime change, and that's a point that probably Macron was very careful to make in his press conference and again in his interview yesterday. But what is it about? It is about the credibility of international law. It's about the credibility of liberal democracy enforcing international law. It's about the rule of law. It's about, is there still an international community able to implement treaties which ban chemical weapons? This is really a principle, I think, which is at stake here. Then, of course, the other issue is, how do you do that? With do you do that with airstrikes? Do you do that with military action? Do you do that by negotiating with the Russians, maybe? Or, I don't know, trying to find... there are some comments in what Macron said over the last few days which hint at trying to look for a political solution. I mean, I don't know. They've been trying to look for political solutions in Syria for some time and without any success. But I think this is a different situation from 2013, and we've learned the lessons from 2013.
Very briefly before we go to the break, you agree, Philippe Moreau-Chevrolet?
Yeah, I think that's what is at stake. The role of the UN is really... you have to wonder why the UN has disappeared from the international scene.
Because Russia vetoes every time.
Yeah. Yes, that's it. But shouldn't we defend it in a way? Shouldn't it be our role? France, we want to free the world and to set things right in the world. That's our general mission in life. Why don't we fight for the UN for a change? That would be a good way to go.
All right, we're going to talk more about Emmanuel Macron's Middle East diplomacy, looking to the Gulf when we come back. Yes, we had the Saudi crown prince in town, 33 years young, and that made a lot of waves in this country. Stay with us. You're watching The World This Week. Does that... Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. Christopher Dickey has been teleported back to headquarters in New York, and who joins us again. Welcome back. Welcome back as well to Sylvie Kaufmann, editorial director at French newspaper of record Le Monde, commentator and political consultant Philippe Moreau-Chevrolet, and Claire Byrne, France editor at the French news agency AFP. AFP, which... must be celebrating the World Press Photo Award. Is one of your photographers, a Mexican photographer whose picture on the Venezuela crisis got the top prize.
That's right. We're very proud.
And there we can see that photo right there. Now, coming back to what we were talking about just before the break, we saw those images of France's president earlier this week in the company of Mohammed bin Salman, the 33-year-old crown prince of Saudi Arabia. Paris, the place to be, by the way, for Arab world diplomacy on Tuesday. Before the opening of the ball, there was the King of Morocco, Mohammed VI, greeted after a recent operation. Morocco, which stayed neutral, by the way, when the Saudis' dispute blew up with Qatar. He was quickly followed that day by Lebanon's prime minister, who stayed for dinner with MBS. Saad Hariri, who the previous night tweeted this picture from a posh Champs-Élysées restaurant in the company of Mohammed VI, and the one furthest in the back is MBS there. Saad Hariri, eager to show that his summoning and sequestering in Riyadh back in November was, well, forgiven and forgotten. How is Saad Hariri when it comes to Twitter, Philippe Moreau-Chevrolet?
He rules, I think. We didn't expect that picture because obviously he had been held captive by the same guy a few months ago. What is surprising about Saudi Arabia is nobody seems to care about the assets held by by the rich Saudis that have been transferred from these rich Saudis under threat to MBS. We don't know exactly what MBS owns in the global economy nowadays. Maybe he owns world businesses in the tourism industry, for instance. We don't know. Maybe they changed from these previous guys to him.
I get the sense you're not buying the narrative that he is a young reformer who's...
A young reformer that holds captive, as captives, I don't know, 47 guys who are the richest guys in the world, basically, or at least in Saudi Arabia. He held them captive for weeks and asked them to sign checks and transfer maybe their industries. So he's modern in a way. Yes, very modern.
Sylvie Kaufmann, what did you think of his visit to Paris?
Well, first it followed a very long visit to the U.S. He spent 3 weeks in the U.S. and 2 days in France. So that gives you the proportion of, the rapport de force between France and the U.S. And then he went on to Madrid, I think, for a couple of days. But I think, of course, I agree with Philippe. He's not your classic reformer, right? I mean, Emmanuel Macron is a reformer.
Quite a few stories about, letting women drive. Next week there's the opening of the first movie theater.
He's a reformer the Saudi way. He's the Saudi version of a reformer, it is true. He's taking steps to have women more equal than they used to be, which is not difficult. So they are going to be allowed to drive. There will be movie theaters. Women are also will be allowed. They have seen a few soccer games, I think, not all of them, just, because it may harm them to see too many of them. But, and the guardianship laws, those famous laws which require them to ask permission from a male in the family if they want to go out, so these guardianship laws allegedly will be phased out gradually. So it's a progress. But of course, if you take European standards,
it's not much. Now,
yeah.
There were no big contracts signed in Paris, just some memorandums of understanding. France, though, once again proving it can monetize its soft power capabilities. Sunday evening, Emmanuel Macron took MBS to the Louvre, where they admired the bare-chested Liberty Leading the People and other masterpieces in an exhibit of Eugène Delacroix that's being shown at that museum. Claire Byrne, some say, this is the French showing their savvy. Others saying, well, we're reduced to just exporting things like there was an announcement that the French are going to help run a new opera house for the Saudis, and that they're going to have an archaeological site for when there's eventually tourism that's open to Saudi Arabia.
Yes. Reduced to, I think that might be putting a pretty negative spin on it from the French perspective, in that they appeared a little bit anxious to get away from this, from only selling Saudi weapons because it's pretty dirty business. And Emmanuel Macron was saying, now with the war in Yemen, there are a lot of questions over how Saudi is using
and French
those
arms
weapons.
sales have doubled, by the way, over that time.
Exactly. Emmanuel Macron was saying during his press conference with MBS, we make sure we vet every sale to Saudi, and we make sure that, they're not going to be used against civilians. We go through it with a fine-tooth comb, but whatever. Anyway, take that. Whether people bought that, I'm not so sure. But they were very keen to kind of, get away from the arms thing to culture and soft power. And there's money in that. This dig in Alula in Saudi, it's not just a dig. It's going to be a massive tourist complex. And they're going to be putting billions into that. So there could be very, very big contracts in that for the French, in construction, tourism, maybe they'd be building museums.
Don't laugh at culture.
Yeah.
Christopher Dickey, what did you think when you saw that tweet from Emmanuel Macron's official account showing that visit of the Louvre?
I thought, well, France is once again showing that it wants to export culture to a country that really can't accept that culture. It's also, we could say the same thing about Abu Dhabi. the Louvre and Abu Dhabi, the idea that France is going to somehow liberalize these extremely conservative societies and extremely conservative polities by shipping art to them is, I think, fairly delusional. But I think that the Arabs, the Arab leadership, understands that it's a way of flattering the French, and then they get down to the brass tacks of arms sales and things like that. Where we didn't hear much was on the question of human rights in Saudi Arabia, which are execrable. It has a terrible human rights record, and that's not getting better. Yes, there are some advances, what really are fairly cosmetic advances for women taking place, but for the broad range of the Saudi people, and particularly for anyone who dares to be what we would call a dissident, it is a very unforgiving society indeed.
Now, it was the week as well where Mark Zuckerberg went to Washington, the founder of Facebook, apologizing before Congress for past privacy breaches and agreeing, in theory, to some form of regulation. This in the wake of the scandal where 300,000 users answered a questionnaire which secured the profiles of friends and friends of friends, so that Cambridge Analytica had access to 87 million accounts. There were apologies that were sent out in the mail this week. What did you think of Mr. Zuckerberg's performance, Philippe Manchevalier?
It's a change. Historically, they never did that. Being held accountable of their actions regarding privacy, it's the first time, and I think it's important that it happened. It didn't really answer to any question convincingly, of course. What is striking is that nobody seems to realize that this Cambridge Analytica business really changed the course of an election and maybe helped getting elected, Trump getting elected. So it's a huge thing. It's not something that you would take lightly. And I think he knows that in a way, and he knows that he's facing in Germany, there is a new regulation, for instance. He's facing a real threat that Facebook could be banned in several countries, that maybe his business could be banned from lucrative markets. So his balance between his own power, which is really huge, and the fact that for the first time somebody tells him, well, maybe we'll wait a little bit, think over it, and then go on with your business maybe. But that's the first time that anyone puts limitation on him, really. And that's a generation of entrepreneurs that never knew limitations. If you look at Tesla's founder, for instance, he's been putting his own car in an orbit around the Earth, which is kind of ludicrous. And there are no limitations to the GAFA in a way. That's the first time that there is one, and that this is significant.
Albeit a symbolic one, and there's Cambridge Analytica. There's also what some have described as the Russian troll farms that sent out messages ahead of the 2016 U.S. presidential election.
Can you guarantee that any of those images that can be attributed or associated with the Russian company Internet Research Agency have been purged from your platform?
Senator, no, I can't guarantee that, because this is an ongoing arms race. As long as there are people sitting in Russia whose job it is to try to interfere with elections around the world, this is going to be an ongoing conflict. What I can commit is that we're going to invest significantly, because this is a top priority, to make sure that people aren't spreading misinformation or trying to interfere in elections on Facebook. But I don't think it would be a realistic expectation to assume that as long as there are people who are employed in Russia for whom this is their job, that we're going to have zero amount of that, or that we're going to be 100% successful at preventing that.
Now, critics say, Christopher Dickey, that yes, he can help to prevent that.
Well, maybe he can, but if I may, Francois, I think that people are kind of missing a major element here. In his testimony, he was asked about, for instance, the effect that Facebook has had in Myanmar, in the massacre of the Rohingya there. It has played a critical role in mobilizing Buddhist opinion, in radicalizing Buddhist opinion, in creating an environment where you could have what amounts to something very close, at least, to a genocide and certainly to ethnic cleansing. And Myanmar is not the only place. I think maybe Philippe would want to comment on this, but in a lot of countries that are what you might call nascent democracies, countries that in the 80s and 90s were moving towards some kind of democratic opening, a conspicuous case would be Iraq after the invasion, all of a sudden there's a lot of open media, but nobody trusts it. What do they wind up trusting? Facebook. Facebook in Iraq is the main source of information for millions of people. And the result has been, in several cases, shootouts between various factions where fake news has led to real shooting. So I think that Facebook has a lot to answer for that actually Zuckerberg was not asked to answer for, because the Americans are so focused on their own particular problems. But Facebook is a problem around the world.
Facebook a problem around the world, and there's this new European legislation that's due to come in the coming days. Can Europe be the one to rein in social media?
Yeah, well, just if I may, I just want to go back very quickly in a second about Saudi Arabia, and I don't want to the viewers to be left with the impression that it's only France investing billions in Saudi Arabia and saying nothing about human rights. I think those $18 billion you mentioned are nothing compared to what the US is investing in Saudi Arabia, and including Silicon Valley, and have no problems with human rights violations either. Now, going back to Zuckerberg, yes, it's one of these funny things that suddenly, I think Zuckerberg himself said sometimes Europeans get things right, and this. But
he didn't say when he would start complying with those new European regulations.
No, of course not, because this protection, this very European concern about protection of private data, of personal data, has been seen for a long time by the internet giants, the American, the Silicon Valley companies, as something which was blocking innovation. That's something which was really hindering their work, and it was considered as kind of unfair competition and so on. And in fact, now we realize that this concern is legitimate, and that maybe the way the European legislations is not so bad after all. So we'll see what happens. But that was an interesting development, I think.
So you're score one for Europe, but Europe has other problems, and it has problems within the 28. It was the week where Hungary's populist prime minister won another landslide re-election. Viktor Orban riding high thanks to a booming economy, but also on the campaign trail, fiery anti-immigrant rhetoric with implicit digs at Angela Merkel and her refugee policy, the Fidesz leader speaking on election night.
We'd like to have continually improving relations with every country. This applies to Germany too. But I was elected not by the German people, but by Hungarians.
By the Hungarians. Claire Byrne, there was this offer for the European Commission president to come and visit in the coming weeks. How should Europe handle Hungary after this election?
Very carefully, I think, because in a year's time we have European elections, and it's, I think, the European Union, in a way, shouldn't be seen to be sort of do anything that people like Orban could construe as punishing people for the way they vote, or, for example, Hungary for his victory, and taking too harsh a line with him, because that could just reinforce anti-EU sentiment ahead of these elections. And we're seeing it now. I think a lot of people thought when Marine Le Pen was defeated last year, and in the Netherlands as well, the far right didn't make it through, that we'd kind of hit peak populism. But we're seeing this year with the elections in Italy, in Hungary, in Austria, there are other countries, that this thing is not over, and we haven't laid it to rest. There's still massive anti-EU sentiment, still massive resentment against globalists like Emmanuel Macron, etc., around Europe. And in the European Parliament, they already have around a third of the seats. And in a year's time, we could be looking at we could possibly be looking at a landslide for parties like this, and a very different dynamic than in Europe in terms of trying to get reforms through. So
he calls himself, if you interview Viktor Orban, he says he's pro-European and he likes Europe. But you wrote in a column this week, Sylvie Kaufmann, that his path shows to what point the trajectory of the great European revolution of 1989, when the Berlin Wall falls, has deviated from its initial course.
Yeah, things didn't turn out the way we expected them to turn out. That's the big disappointment, if I may. We expected all these new democracies to become just like Western democracies, and in fact, what's happening is that we are becoming, as like the Polish and Hungarian model. I shouldn't say model, but let's say what their governments, this populist trend, is coming back to Western Europe, as you described, and in Austria and Italy with AfD in Germany, which is not in power, of course, but which has 94 members of parliament in Bundestag. So it's a very worrying trend, and I think we have and it's not only a Central European trend; it's a European trend now, and it's also a trend in America, as we have seen.
And but another trend that Hungary has seen is the media under assault. We were talking about a minute ago with Facebook. This week saw the death of another newspaper in Hungary, conservative daily Magyar Nemzet, an 80-year-old institution. Its death, now arguably precipitated by the owners falling out with Orban. That's open for argument. A clearer-cut case is the pro-government magazine Figyelő, targeting critical journalists, and as András Petho of investigative outfit Direct36 tweeted, publishing a list of George Soros's people, the Hungarian-born American philanthropist Philippe Moreau-Chevrolet, and there is talk that, well, it smacks of anti-Semitism as well.
Yes, there are two things interesting in this Hungarian case. The first is, when should we call a dictatorship and stop calling it democracy? Because obviously Hungary is not a democracy anymore, but nobody seems to be willing to say it.
Well, they had elections, they had open...
Yeah, it looks like a democracy. It has the taste, a little bit of a democracy, but it's a dictatorship, right? Shouldn't we be calling it a dictatorship? Maybe we should be considering that.
But how is it a dictatorship?
No freedom of the press, targeting of formerly Hungarian Jewish citizens, suspected of being liberals because, they are rich and Jewish. And this is, there are more than enough signs to see that Hungary maybe is not a democracy anymore. And the second thing I would add is that, of course, maybe the 99 revolution has failed in a way, but that's right that the populist trend is reaching out. Some researchers at the American University in Paris even say that in France, we had a populist election last time, and maybe Macron was a populist for the upper classes, maybe Mélenchon was a populist for a very different class, and Marine Le Pen also. Maybe there is a general populist trend in Europe. But maybe we should start to distinguish between real dictatorships, false democracies.
I don't think you can. We have a word in French, it's démocrature. It's a new word, which is, it's not a dictatorship, and it's not
he says it's an illiberal democracy. And
it's illiberal democracy, in one of my classes, but I disagree with dictatorship.
In one of my classes at Sciences Po, a student came up with the word dictocracy.
We will argue the semantics of it. I want to thank you very much, Sylvie Kaufmann, Philippe Moreau-Chevrolet, Claire Byrne, Christopher Dickey for being with us from the Daily Beast headquarters in New York City. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to Emma James.
Hi there.
After Fire and Fury.
Yes.
Another book is out.
Absolutely.
Out soon, rather, I should say.
Out soon, yes. Although we are getting quite a few leaks already. So lots of people already getting an idea of exactly what tone James Comey's book is going to take. For it is he, the former FBI director, who is due to have his book out very shortly. And it comes at a particularly tricky time for Donald Trump. This is the Time magazine front page of a forthcoming edition, April the 23rd, that's out.
What is this, on their website?
Yes, they've released this on Twitter. As you can see, the heading is stormy, because it is a very tricky time for Donald Trump right now. It's a reworking. If it looks familiar, it should be, because it's a reworking of the one on the left, which was done in February last year, which was done to depict the chaos of his first days in office. And, of course, clearly now they think things have gotten a lot worse.
And it just happens to be the first name of the adult entertainment actors.
Exactly. I don't think that's any coincidence. I think we can rest assured on that one.
Good.
But as for James Comey, well, his book, A Higher Loyalty, is causing quite a stir, to say the least. The New York Times book review calls it absorbing and impassioned, saying the central themes are the toxic consequences of lying, choosing loyalty to an individual over truth and the rule of law. I think we all know what individual they're talking about. However, they go on to say that the volume offers very little in the way of hard news revelations, which is no surprise, really. Lots of people calling this a tell-all book, but it's not, and it really can't be, because there are so many ongoing legal shenanigans unfolding as we speak. What is probably the most interesting thing is a comment by John Kelly, where apparently he called Donald Trump dishonourable for firing James Comey. Now, it comes as John Kelly's standing in the White House is reportedly falling pretty rapidly, and Vox has picked up on one photo in particular that was tweeted out by Donald Trump, which shows his diminished standing. There he is in the background. If you can't quite make it out, they've zoomed in on him. That was tweeted out by Donald Trump, not particularly to shame John Kelly, but as you can see, he's not exactly looking an important part of this particular meeting. Now, this has been published by Vox, as I say. This tweet has now been deleted, the one from Donald Trump. Others focusing very much more on the salacious elements that are going to be in this book, including, of course, talking about the so-called dodgy dossier, which alleges that Donald Trump had a rather soggy encounter with some Russian prostitutes. Apparently, Donald Trump himself is particularly fixated on that, or at least was, and wanted James Comey to prove that it hadn't ever happened. The New York Daily News's take on this is pea brain, because clearly he had pea on the brain, which is rather unfortunate. You wouldn't be surprised at all to see this as the reaction from the Republican Party. Comey will try to peddle his story in an upcoming book tour, but he has no one but himself to blame for his complete lack of credibility. Most interestingly with this tweet is that it actually links to another website, lioncomey.com, which has been paid for by the Republican National Committee.
By the Republican National Committee?
Yes, I kid you not. It says it at the bottom, and they have done it directly in response to this forthcoming book. It has all sorts of information on it that is supposed to deem him to be highly untrustworthy. Donald Trump, of course, we've all seen the reactions by now. He's called him an untruthful slimeball, a leaker and a liar who should be prosecuted, and he said it was his honour to fire him. Fact Check has come up with this today, tweeting they couldn't even be bothered to write a new article. They said they've already disproved the argument that Comey had somehow leaked classified information. And looking at this one, terrible noise in my ear, let me just remove my earpiece. So yes, Newsweek have poured cold water really on the idea that nobody believes James Comey, because they've done a poll, or they're carrying the poll on their article anyway. More people trust James Comey, 48% of Americans, compared with 32% trusting Donald Trump.
If Christopher Dickey is still with us in New York, Chris, you with us? We've lost Christopher Dickey, but that's an interesting point there. Philippe Moreau-Chevrolet, these books, do they matter?
Yeah, they do matter, because the accumulation of books against Trump will give credibility to the opponents against Trump. The very fact that these guys are so clumsy that they would make a huge PR stunt for this book and his author is really something
Trump's tweet is clumsy.
Yeah, it's clumsy, yes. I think it's very violent, so it's a way to... He always does that, you know, designating someone and saying that this guy is crooked or anyone. He's always distinguishing radically between his enemies and his friends, but it's a little bit too much because it gives credibility to the guy.
It is interesting to note, though, that it isn't just Republicans and the Trump base that are upset about this. This article in The Hill is written by Brent Bodowski, who is a Democrat. He calls the book shameful and despicable and says this kind of garbage should be beneath the dignity and honour of any director or former director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation.
We'll leave it there. Many thanks, Emma James. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in The World This Week.